The ultimatum, the grand assembly station, hung in the void like a massive flower made of metal and light. Its 12 arms stretched out into space, each one capable of docking 1,000 ships. For 300 years, this station had been the center of galactic diplomacy. Today, it would witness something that had never happened before. Ambassador Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cool metal of the observation deck's window. Outside, ships from across the galaxy moved in careful patterns around the station. Some were elegant and curved like works of art. Others were blocky and practical, built for function over beauty. A few looked more like living creatures than machines, their organic hulls pulsing with strange lights. Quite a sight, isn't it? Captain Marcus Torres joined her at the window. The military man's dress uniform was perfectly pressed, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. I count vessels from at least 50 different species out there. 67, actually, said Dr. Elena Vasquez as she approached with a tablet in her hands. The xenobiologist had been studying the arriving delegations for hours. Though most of them won't have any real say in what happens here today. Sarah turned away from the window. At 45, she had been Earth's chief diplomat for nearly a decade. She had negotiated trade agreements, border disputes, and cultural exchanges with dozens of alien species. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for this gathering. 13. 3 most powerful civilizations in the galaxy had called this assembly. They claimed it was time to bring order to the chaos that had plagued the Outer Rim territories for the past 50 years. Pirates, rebels, and independent colonies had been disrupting trade and challenging the established order. Something had to be done, they said. Sarah had agreed to attend because Earth's colonies in the Outer Rim had also been affected by the chaos. Human settlements had been raided, trade ships attacked, and several mining operations had been forced to shut down. If the major powers had a plan to restore peace and stability, humanity would listen. Now, after 3 days of preliminary meetings, Sarah was beginning to understand that this was not about peace at all. The conference hall was a marvel of engineering. The circular chamber was large enough to hold representatives from over 100 species, with each delegation provided seating appropriate to their biology. The humans sat in standard chairs in a section near the middle of the hall. They were neither honored guests nor outcasts, just another minor species among many. At the center of the hall stood a raised platform where the speakers addressed the assembly. Above it, holographic displays could show star charts, documents, or anything else needed for the discussions. Today, those displays showed the seal of the Galactic Harmony Accord. High Counselor Vexitar of the Kethmori Empire was the first to speak. The reptilian being stood nearly 8 feet tall, his scales gleaming like polished emeralds under the hall's lights. His species had controlled the galactic north for over 1,000 years, building their empire on military might and strict order. Fellow beings of this galaxy, Vextar's voice rumbled through the hall's translation systems. We gather today to address a crisis that threatens us all. The Outer Rim territories have become a haven for criminals, rebels, and anarchists. Trade routes are unsafe. Peaceful colonies live in fear. The very foundations of galactic civilization are under attack. Murmurs of agreement rippled through many sections of the hall. The Kethmori had indeed brought stability to their territories, though that stability came at the cost of absolute obedience to imperial rule. Fleet Commander Zalthos spoke next. The insectoid being represented the Hive Collective, a group of species that had merged their minds into a single consciousness. Her chittering voice was translated into words, but something was lost in the process. When the Hive spoke, it was with the voice of billions. The collective consciousness perceives the disruption in the galactic harmony. Zalthos clicked and whistled. Individual thoughts create chaos. Unity creates order. The Outer Rim must be brought into harmony with the greater whole. Finally, Trade Minister Golfin of the Crystalline Trade Consortium approached the platform. His body was composed of living crystal that shifted and changed color as he moved. The consortium controlled most of the galaxy's economic systems, and their influence reached into every corner of civilized space. Respected delegates, Golfin's voice rang like chimes. The economic data is clear. The disruptions in the Outer Rim have cost the galactic economy over 2 trillion credits. In the past decade alone, this cannot continue. Order must be restored and those responsible must be held accountable. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard speeches like these before, during her studies of Earth's history. When powerful groups talked about bringing order and holding people accountable, it rarely ended well for those with less power. The Galactic Harmony Accord was presented as the solution to all problems. The document appeared on every delegate's personal display, translated into their native languages. Sarah began reading immediately, her diplomatic training helping her navigate the complex legal language. At first, the accord seemed reasonable. It established new trade routes, created joint security forces to patrol dangerous areas, and set up systems for peaceful resolution of disputes. But as Sarah read deeper, the true nature of the document became clear. The accord divided all galactic territories into 3 zones of influence. The Kethmori Empire would control the north, the Hive Collective would manage the east, and the Trade Consortium would oversee the west and south. Any species with territories in these zones would become protectorates of the controlling power. For humanity, this meant disaster. Earth itself was in neutral space and would remain independent, but 60% of human colonies were in territories that would fall under alien control. The accord required these colonies to provide voluntary labor forces for infrastructure, projects, surrender excess resources to the controlling powers, and submit all technological developments for security review. Captain Torres leaned over to read Sarah's display. His jaw tightened as he saw the terms. Dr. Vasquez had gone pale, her hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through the document. "This isn't a peace treaty," Torres whispered. "It's a surrender document." Sarah continued reading. The accord also required all protectorate species to acknowledge past enforcement actions as necessary for galactic stability. Sarah knew this was referring to the fate of species that had previously resisted the 3 powers. The Mordaki had been enslaved for refusing to share their crystal-growing technology. The Yelnari had been scattered across the galaxy after their homeworld was declared strategically necessary for Kethmori expansion. The Zinfari had simply vanished after challenging consortium trade practices. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. Around the hall, Sarah could see other delegates reading the accord with various expressions of shock, fear, and resignation. Some species were nodding in agreement, either genuinely supporting the terms or simply too afraid to object. Others sat in stunned silence, probably realizing for the first time what they had walked into. High Counselor Vextar returned to the platform. The Galactic Harmony Accord represents a new era of peace and prosperity for all species. Those who embrace order will find their place in the new galaxy. Those who choose chaos. He let the threat hang in the air. Fleet Commander Zalthos added, "The collective offers unity to all beings. Resistance is not logical. Compliance brings harmony. Trade." Minister Golfin's crystal body flashed with different colors as he spoke. The economic benefits of cooperation far outweigh the costs of independence. Wise species will see the advantage of joining the new galactic order. A period of questions and discussion followed, but it quickly became clear that this was not really a negotiation. Delegates who raised concerns about the accord's terms were reminded of what had happened to species that had caused problems in the past. The 3 powers had examples ready for every objection. When the Velkani delegate questioned the labor requirements, Vextar showed images of former Mordaki cities now serving as efficient manufacturing centers. When the Pixran representative worried about resource quotas, Golfin displayed economic projections showing how former independent colonies were now thriving under consortium management. The message was always the same: obey or be replaced by those who will. Sarah watched as species after species fell silent. Some were clearly terrified. Others seemed resigned to their fate. A few appeared to be genuinely convinced that submission was their best option, but none were willing to stand up and say no. During a recess, the human delegation gathered in, A small conference room assigned to them. The space was barely large enough for the three of them, but it was private. "We can't sign this," Torres said immediately. "If we accept these terms, we're condemning 60% of human colonies to slavery." Dr. Vasquez was scrolling through xenological databases on her tablet. "I've been researching the species that refuse to cooperate with the three powers in the past. Captain Torres is right about what happened to them. The Mordaki were given similar terms 50 years ago. When they refused, the Kethmori moved in with a peacekeeping force and never left." Sarah sat quietly, thinking through their impossible situation. Earth's military was small compared to any of the three powers. Humanity had 47 ships capable of interstellar combat. The Kethmori Empire alone had over 3,000. In a direct military confrontation, humanity would be destroyed within weeks. But accepting the accord would mean the slow death of human independence and dignity. Their colonies would become labor camps, their technology would be seized, and their people would become second-class citizens in their own territories. "What about the other species?" Sarah asked. "Are any of them planning to refuse?" Dr. Vasquez shook her head. "I've been monitoring the informal discussions during breaks. Everyone is afraid. Some of the older diplomats remember what happened. To the resistors, they're all going to sign." Torres stood and began pacing in the small space. "So we have a choice between a quick death and a slow one. Either way, human freedom ends today." Sarah looked at her two colleagues. These were good people who had dedicated their lives to serving humanity and promoting peace throughout the galaxy. They deserved better than this impossible choice. All of humanity deserved better. "What if we just said no?" she asked quietly. Both Torres and Vasquez stared at her. "Ambassador," Torres said carefully, "if we refuse to sign, they'll destroy Earth. They have the power to do it, and they've done it before." "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But what if they don't? What if their threats are mostly bluff? Think about it logically. They're calling this the Galactic Harmony Accord, not the Galactic Conquest Treaty. They want legitimacy. They want the smaller species to voluntarily submit, because ruling through pure force is expensive and difficult." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her tablet. "You think they need our cooperation more than they're letting on?" "I think they need everyone's cooperation," Sarah said. "Look at the math. There are 127 species represented here today. If even half of them resist, the three powers would have to fight 60 different wars simultaneously. Even with their advantages, that would be incredibly costly." Torres stopped pacing. "But if we're the only ones who refuse, we become an example of what happens to resistors. Or," Sarah said, "we become an example of what's possible when someone has the courage to say no." The break was ending, and delegates were filing back into the main hall. Sarah stood and straightened her jacket. She had made her decision. "I'm going to reject the accord," she announced. "Not just the parts that hurt humanity, but the entire document. I'm going to stand up in front of everyone and explain why no free being should accept these terms." Torres and Vasquez exchanged looks. Then, simultaneously, they both stood as well. "If you're going to make a stand," Torres said, "you won't make it alone. The xenological evidence supports your position," Dr. Vasquez added. "Species that submit to domination rarely recover their independence. This might be our only chance." They walked back into the main hall together. Around them, delegates were settling into their seats for the final session. At the front of the hall, the three power leaders waited to receive the formal acceptance of their accord. Sarah took her place at the human delegations table. In a few minutes, she would either make history or end it. But for the first time since arriving at the Grand Assembly Station, she felt truly free. The choice was made. Now came the hard part. The Walkaway High Counselor Vextar called the assembly to order with a ceremonial strike of his staff against the platform floor. The sound echoed through the vast chamber like a death knell. Around the hall, delegates shifted nervously in their seats, knowing that the moment of decision had arrived. "Esteemed representatives," Vexatar's voice rumbled through the translation. "Systems, we have discussed the Galactic Harmony Accord at length. The benefits of cooperation have been explained. The consequences of resistance have been made clear. It is time for each species to make their choice. The voting process was designed to be public and ceremonial. Each delegation would be called by name, and their representative would stand to announce their decision. The three powers had arranged the order deliberately, starting with species that were certain to comply and building momentum for acceptance. One by one, delegations rose to announce their agreement with the accord. The Velcani, whose homeworld had been protected by Kethmori forces for the past 20 years, quickly agreed. The Pixran, whose economy depended entirely on consortium trade agreements, enthusiastically endorsed the terms. The Yildar, whose military had been integrated into Hive collective defense forces, spoke of the honor of unity. Sarah watched as species after species surrendered their independence with carefully worded speeches about cooperation and mutual benefit. She could see the fear in many of their representatives' eyes, but none were willing to be the first to stand against the three powers. When the human delegation's turn came, the hall fell silent. Everyone knew that humanity was one of the larger minor species, with colonies throughout the outer rim. Their decision would carry weight. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the eyes of every being in the chamber upon her. She had given diplomatic speeches before, but never one that would determine the fate of her entire species. She walked to the front of her section, where a small speaking platform waited. High Counselor Vextar, Fleet Commander Zalthos, Trade Minister Golfin, and fellow delegates, she began, her voice steady and clear. I have carefully reviewed the Galactic Harmony Accord on behalf of the human species. The three power leaders leaned forward slightly, expecting the standard acceptance speech. Around the hall, other delegates prepared to mark another victory for the new order. The accord promises peace and prosperity for all species, Sarah continued. It offers protection from chaos and security from uncertainty. These are noble goals that any reasonable being would support. Vextar nodded approvingly. This was going exactly as expected. However, Sarah's voice grew stronger. The methods proposed to achieve these goals are unacceptable to the human species. The accord does not offer partnership. It demands submission. It does not provide protection. It requires surrender. It does not bring peace. It institutionalizes oppression. A shocked silence fell over the hall. No one had expected such direct criticism of the accord. Several delegates looked around nervously as if expecting immediate retaliation. Sarah pressed on. The terms of this accord would strip away the fundamental rights of billions of beings across the galaxy. It would turn free colonies into labor camps, independent species into servants, and proud civilizations into footnotes in someone else's history. This is not harmony. This is conquest dressed in diplomatic language. Fleet Commander Zalthos rose from her seat, her insectoid features twitching with agitation. The human delegate speaks of concepts that create disharmony. Individual desires must yield to collective necessity. No, Sarah replied firmly. Individual freedom is not a luxury to be traded away for security. It is the foundation of everything that makes life worth living. Without freedom, we are not civilizations at all. We are simply collections of beings waiting to be told what to do. Trade Minister Golfin's crystal body flashed angry red. The economic realities are clear. Species that refuse cooperation will be excluded from galactic commerce. They will face poverty and isolation. Then we will face poverty and isolation as free beings, Sarah declared. Humanity rejects the Galactic Harmony Accord in its entirety. We will not submit to foreign rule. We will not surrender our colonies. We will not accept that genocide and slavery are necessary for galactic peace. The reaction was immediate and electric. Delegates throughout the hall began talking at once, their voices creating a chaos of different languages and translation systems. Some seemed shocked that anyone would dare refuse the accord. Others appeared thoughtful, as if Sarah's words had awakened something they had been trying to suppress. High Counselor Vextar struck his staff against the platform repeatedly, calling for order. When the noise finally died down, his voice was filled with cold anger. The human delegate seems to misunderstand the situation, he said. This is not a negotiation. The galactic powers have decided that order must be restored. Species can choose to be part of that order willingly, or they can be made part of it by force. There is no third option. Sarah looked directly at the reptilian leader. There is always a third option, High Counselor. We can choose to walk away. Walk away to what? Vextar demanded. Humanity has 47 ships. The Empire has 3,000. You cannot fight us. You cannot hide from us. If you refuse the accord, you will be destroyed. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, but we will be destroyed as free beings, not as slaves. And maybe our destruction will remind others of what freedom is worth. Captain Torres stood up behind Sarah. The human military formally refuses to serve under foreign command. Our ships will defend human territory and human people. We will not attack anyone, but we will not surrender to anyone either. Dr. Vasquez also rose. The human scientific community refuses to share technology with conquerors. Our knowledge will serve humanity and our freely chosen allies, not those who would enslave us. Around the hall, something was changing. The delegate from the Zephyrian Republic, a peaceful species known for their philosophers and artists, slowly stood up. Her voice was quiet but clear. The Zephyrian Republic withdraws its acceptance of the accord. We cannot in good conscience endorse a document that legalizes oppression. A murmur ran through the hall. The Zephyrians were not a powerful species militarily, but they were respected throughout the galaxy for their wisdom and moral courage. Their withdrawal was unexpected. The delegate from the Mordaki remnant rose next. His people had been enslaved by the Kethmori 50 years ago, and the few free colonies that remained had been living in fear ever since. The Mordaki have experienced the reality of Kethmori protection, he said bitterly. We will not voluntarily accept what was forced upon our brothers and sisters. The Mordaki remnant rejects the accord. More delegates began standing. The Falkeshi, whose trade routes had been seized by the consortium decades ago. The Jinpari, who had watched their neighbors disappear into hive collective consciousness. The Tekmani, the Vilrotha, the Kesplari. One by one, species that had been preparing to surrender found their courage. Sarah's refusal had shown them that resistance was possible, even if it seemed hopeless. The three power leaders watched in growing alarm as their carefully orchestrated acceptance began to crumble. Nearly 30 species had now withdrawn their support for the accord. Others were whispering among themselves, clearly reconsidering their positions. Fleet Commander Zalthos activated a communication device. Within minutes, holographic displays around the hall showed hive warships moving toward the Grand Assembly Station. The message was clear: submit or face immediate consequences. The collective will not permit this disruption of galactic harmony, Zalthos announced. Species that refuse cooperation will be brought into compliance immediately. But instead of frightening the dissenting delegates back into submission, the show of force had the opposite effect. The sight of military threats being used against a diplomatic gathering outraged even some of the species that had initially supported the accord. The delegate from the ancient Ethmori Dominion stood with great dignity. His species was older than any of the three powers, and their words carried weight throughout the galaxy. The Ethmori have observed galactic politics for 3,000 years, he said solemnly. We have seen empires rise and fall, peace and war, wisdom and folly. But we have never seen a diplomatic gathering threatened with military force by those who claim to represent order and law. This is not governance. This is thuggery. The Ethmori withdrawal sent shockwaves through the remaining delegates. If even the ancient and powerful Dominion was refusing the accord, perhaps the three powers were not as invincible as they seemed. Trade Minister Golfin tried a different approach. Economic sanctions will be imposed immediately on all species, refusing the accord. No trade, no technological exchange, no economic cooperation of any kind. You will be isolated from galactic commerce. The delegate from the Hardy Miners Coalition laughed harshly. You threaten to cut us off from systems that already exploit us? The coalition controls asteroid mining throughout the Rim territories. Let's see how your precious economy functions without raw materials. Similar responses came from other resource-producing species. The consortium's threats were less frightening when they realized how much the major powers depended on cooperation from the minor ones. High Counselor Vexitar was clearly losing control of the situation. The carefully planned acceptance ceremony had turned into open rebellion. He activated his own communication systems, and holographic displays showed Keth Mori battle fleets moving toward the territories of resisting species. "The Empire will restore order," he declared. "Rebellious colonies will be occupied. Resistant populations will be relocated. The accord will be implemented with or without consent." Sarah stepped forward again. "High Counselor, you're proving our point better than we ever could. You claim to offer peace and harmony, but your first response to disagreement is violence and oppression. How can anyone trust a system that begins with threats?" She turned to address the entire hall. "Look around you. More than 40 species have now rejected this accord. We represent billions of beings who refuse to surrender their freedom. The three powers cannot conquer all of us simultaneously without destroying the very galaxy they claim to want to protect." The momentum was building. More delegates were standing. More species were withdrawing their support for the accord. The Stellar Collective, the Void Wanderers, the Crystal Singers, the Metal Shapers, species after species found their courage as they realized they were not alone. Captain Torres stepped forward with tactical information he had been gathering throughout the crisis. The three powers have been presenting themselves as invincible, but their own actions show their weakness. Look at how quickly they resort to threats. Look at how desperately they need voluntary compliance. They cannot rule through pure force because they lack the resources to occupy every system that resists them. Dr. Vasquez added her analysis. The major powers have been weakened by centuries of expansion and internal conflicts. The Keth Mori Empire is facing rebellions in 12 sectors. The Hive Collective is dealing with disconnection syndrome in several subordinate species. The Trade Consortium is struggling with debt and resource shortages. They need the accord to work because they cannot afford the alternative. The revelation that the three powers were not as strong as they appeared sent waves of excitement through the dissenting delegates. If the giants had feet of clay, then resistance might actually succeed. High Counselor Vextar made one final attempt to restore control. "This assembly is concluded. The accord will be implemented regardless of the decisions made here today. Species that refuse to comply will face the consequences of their choice." Sarah smiled calmly. "Then this assembly has served its purpose, though not the one you intended. You wanted us to surrender voluntarily, and instead, you've shown us that resistance is not only possible but necessary." She turned to the other dissenting delegates. "Any species that wishes to coordinate resistance to the accord is welcome to join us. We propose the formation of the Free Species Alliance, dedicated to mutual defense and the preservation of independence for all beings who choose freedom over submission." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Delegates rushed forward to discuss details, exchange contact information, and pledge mutual support. What had begun as a surrender ceremony was transforming into the birth of a resistance movement. The three power leaders left the hall in fury, their plans in ruins. They had expected to leave with the voluntary submission of over 100 species. Instead, they faced the prospect of fighting dozens of coordinated rebellions simultaneously. As the Grand Assembly Station began to empty, Sarah stood with her fellow humans and their new allies. They had walked into what was supposed to be humanity's surrender, and instead they had sparked a galactic revolution. Captain Torres was already discussing defense strategies with military representatives from other species. Dr. Vasquez was sharing information about resistance movements throughout history. Sarah was coordinating diplomatic communications with dozens of worlds. The fight for galactic freedom had begun, and it had started with the simple but powerful act of saying no. In the weeks that followed, the Free Species Alliance grew from 40 founding members to over 70. The three powers discovered that conquering unwilling populations was far more difficult than intimidating isolated delegations. Their forces were spread thin across multiple fronts, their resources strained by constant resistance. More importantly, the galaxy had remembered what freedom meant. Species that had lived under foreign rule for generations began to rebel. Colonies that had accepted oppression as inevitable started to fight back. The example of the humans and their allies had shown that the seemingly impossible was actually achievable. The Grand Assembly Station continued to orbit in neutral space, but it was no longer a symbol of imposed order. It had become a reminder that free beings, when they find the courage to stand together, can change the course of history. Sarah Chen returned to Earth as a hero, but she knew that the real victory belonged to all the species that had found their courage in that crucial moment. Humanity had not just saved itself by walking away from the negotiations. It had helped save the galaxy by showing that sometimes the most powerful word in any language is simply no. The Galactic Harmony Accord was never implemented. The three powers eventually had to negotiate genuine peace treaties with the Free Species Alliance, accepting the reality that their age of unopposed dominance was over. The galaxy had learned that true harmony could only come from free choice, not forced submission, and it all began with the moment when humanity looked at an impossible choice and decided to walk away. As the Grand Assembly Station began to empty, Sarah stood with her fellow humans and their new allies. They had walked into what was supposed to be humanity's surrender, and instead, they had sparked a galactic revolution. Captain Torres was already discussing defense strategies with military representatives from other species. Dr. Vasquez was sharing information about resistance movements throughout history. Sarah was coordinating diplomatic communications with dozens of worlds. The fight for galactic freedom had begun, and it had started with the simple but powerful act of saying no. In the weeks that followed, the Free Species Alliance grew from 40 founding members to over 70. The three powers discovered that conquering unwilling populations was far more difficult than intimidating isolated delegations. Their forces were spread thin across multiple fronts, their resources strained by constant resistance. More importantly, the galaxy had remembered what freedom meant. Species that had lived under foreign rule for generations began to rebel. Colonies that had accepted oppression as inevitable started to fight back. The example of the humans and their allies had shown that the seemingly impossible was actually achievable. The Grand Assembly Station continued to orbit in neutral space, but it was no longer a symbol of imposed order. It had become a reminder that free beings, when they find the courage to stand together, can change the course of history. Sarah Chen returned to Earth as a hero, but she knew that the real victory belonged to all the species that had found their courage in that crucial moment. Humanity had not just saved itself by walking away from the negotiations. It had helped save the galaxy by showing that sometimes the most powerful word in any language is simply no. The Galactic Harmony Accord was never implemented. The three powers eventually had to negotiate genuine peace treaties with the Free Species Alliance, accepting the reality that their age of unopposed dominance was over. The galaxy had learned that true harmony could only come from free choice, not forced submission. And it all began with the moment when humanity looked at an impossible choice and decided to walk away.